and we'll turn it all over to Liz. Charlie, have you met Liz Neely?
I don't think
Hi,
until
Liz.
now.
Liz
Hello.
is our speaker today. She's running the communications workshop. She did a fantastic job during Alumni Weekend, and some of our staff who are also alumni were so impressed. They said, "We've got to get her." So she's going to do the work. She's going to do the work.
Oh, wait a minute. I know Liz. Liz,
Story Collider,
I
ex-Story
was one of many people who was on your last training session with the UCSF faculty.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, you look small on this little postage stamp on my computer. But yeah,
But you know it's me because it's the grin from ear to ear, which is my default state.
That was a fantastic. I apologize. I didn't do my little follow-up thing because I'm running a task force for COVID.
I'm not sure I'm ever going to be able to forgive you.
I'm so sorry. No, but I did the first one, and I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
That was so well done. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. You can tell. I mean, like, you can tell I'm so lucky. I feel like I have had the best job in the world for a long time, and it is such a joy to be able to talk about these ideas with people and then watch them light up and do their own things with them.
Yeah.
The best.
No, you're really good at it. Really good at it.
Okay, folks, sorry to interrupt, but it is close to the start time, so we wanted to go ahead and get started. So just a reminder before I let folks in from the waiting room to please mute yourself unless you are speaking, and also to pay attention to the chats in case I need to send you a private message to let you know something. And with that, is there any last comments before we get ready to go?
Nope, open up the doors.
Okay, so if you are not a speaker, please, and don't need to be on camera, please turn off your camera. I think that only applies to me and Karsten, perhaps. And I'll go ahead and let folks in.
I'll turn mine off to start with, if you think that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. All right, I'll get started.
Jessica, are we ready to start? Yes?
Go for it.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I want to welcome all of you new Discovery Fellows and thank you all for being here. Before I forget, because I often forget to say this, I just want to let you know that we're recording this session because there are a few Discovery Fellows who weren't able to join us. Also, I'm not going to be able to stay for the communications seminar because I have to go to the Academic Senate Graduate Council meeting, so I'm going to want to watch this afterwards. I want to welcome you all. You are all third years, and so we're going to spend the first half hour talking about the program, and then the fourth years and fifth years will join us for the communications presentation that we have lined up for you, so I'll say more about that in a moment. But first, let me talk about you. You have all been selected to be Discovery Fellows, not only because you exemplify excellence in your research, but also because you've shown that you're able to clearly and enthusiastically articulate the importance of the research being conducted at UCSF. And so as such, we're going to ask you as Discovery Fellows over the next 3 years to serve as an ambassador and an advocate for UCSF's basic science graduate programs. So there's really two things I hope you'll be able to advocate for: basic science, also graduate education. Let me tell you a little bit about the funds, because Discovery Fellow, sometimes it's a little bit of a misnomer in terms of the funding. And my colleague from University Development will have more to say about this in a minute, but I just want to be really clear that the Discovery Endowment supports all basic science students. Let me say that again. All basic science students at UCSF at some point in their careers, usually in their first or second career, get some money either for their tuition remission or in their stipend that comes from this endowment. So that is everybody. There's all students since we started in, I think, 2013, starting with the first years then, or maybe it was 2014, all students receive some money. So it's pretty extraordinary. So what does that mean about fellows? So then what the second part of the program is that we name this new cohort of fellows in the third year. So I think you know this already, but I'll just remind you, you're appointed for 3 years. And during that time, we hope to be able to provide you with opportunities to advocate for graduate education and for basic science to a variety of stakeholders. I may ask you if we can ever be back in person again, or we may do it by Zoom, to come and talk to legislators. Come with me. We used to go to Sacramento and to Washington, DC each year to talk to state and federal legislators. And since COVID, I've been working with some of the fifth year Discovery Fellows to do these advocacy visits by Zoom. It may be to talk to alumni. We have lots of different alumni events. We like to get them engaged. They're important for us to keep contact, and they love to meet current students. It may be donors. We may be doing some kind of event for people in our philanthropic community, and they too like to meet students. So lots of different opportunities. And then what we like to do every fall is to give you a communication skills building workshop. Were we in person, this would be a lot more interactive. It'll be more of a seminar format today, although I know that our presenter has built in lots of ways for you to engage. But it is what it is. You're probably used to this now. COVID means we're all looking at small boxes on our screen. I also want to remind you that as appointed Discovery Fellows, you're appointed by your programs, you'll receive $2,000 in each of years 3, 4, and 5. This is separate, again, from the funding for your stipend. And this is really meant for you to support your research, whether you need to buy equipment or, in the future when we can travel to conferences or to other labs, that's what those funds are intended for. Okay. So today you are our pioneers because this is our very first virtual workshop that we're putting on. And the plan is, as I said, we'll start with an overview of the program with Jessica Jamback. And then our dear colleague, Charlie Craig, many of you may know him as a member of our faculty, is going to share a story of Michael Page and his legacy, which is a really special part of the Discovery Fellows program. And then at 2:15, the other Discovery Fellows will join us for the workshop led by Liz Neely, and I'll introduce her then. But let me introduce to you now Jessica Jamback. She has been at UCSF since 2012 as the Director of Development for Basic and Translational Science. And she was the campaign director for the Discovery Fellows Program when it was first founded in 2013. She's been with it ever since. I'm going to let her boast about how much it's grown over the last 7 years, thanks a lot to her work. And she currently serves as the Assistant Vice Chancellor for University Development and Alumni Relations. So Jessica, take it away.
Thank you, Liz. So it's a pleasure to see all of you today. I wish we were in person, but thank you so much for joining us on this virtual platform. First off, congratulations on your selection as a Discovery Fellow. We're looking forward to an informative workshop with Liz Neely later this afternoon, when we'll be joined by the other fellows. Next slide, please. But for now, here's our brief agenda for your orientation, and we'll keep it simple. First, we wanted to welcome you to the Discovery Fellows program. Then we'll go over your role as a Discovery Fellow. And I'll provide some history and background on the program itself, followed by annual highlights so you can know what to expect each year. And then finally, we'll wrap up with a story from our special faculty guest, Charlie Craig. Next slide, please. We hope that you will find your role as a Discovery Fellow both enriching and rewarding. So first and foremost, as Dean Watkins mentioned earlier, we ask that you act as an enthusiastic ambassador and advocate, not just for the program, but for UCSF at large. From time to time, the development office, that's me or someone on my team or Dean Watkins' team, may reach out to you to participate in events or meetings. For the foreseeable future, these will be virtual until it's safe again to meet in person. But examples could include small donor thank you seminars. They used to be lunches, but now they might be over FaceTime or Zoom, or participating in the Spring Discovery Fellows Research Symposium. These meetings and events, we hope, will also serve as unique networking opportunities for each of you to interface with our donors, our friends, and alumni. Next slide. So what is the Discovery Fellows program? If you're going to be an ambassador for it, you need to know what it is. So it made history in 2013 when it became the largest endowed program for PhD students in the history of the entire University of California system. And 2013 was not too long ago, so it's a fairly young program. All of this was made possible by the generosity of two special donors named Michael Moritz and Harriet Heyman, who you see pictured here with a group of Discovery Fellows. Michael and Harriet made this initial $25 million gift that seeded the endowment, and it has brought us to where we are today. And you'll notice that Michael and Harriet didn't name this program after them. These days, donors like to have their names emblazoned across the program, but Michael and Harriet are not like that. In fact, they wanted the program to be named after all of you. Hence, it's called the Discovery Fellows Program, to highlight the brilliant scientists that it supports. Next slide, please. So thanks to their initial investment and a matching challenge that it catalyzed, to date, the endowment has grown to over $100 million. In fact, last week, we just crossed the $101 million mark. And importantly, over 1,200 unique different donors have made gifts at all levels that are right for them, which is exactly what Michael and Harriet wanted to inspire. It's been wonderful to see the UCSF donor community come together to support PhD basic science education in such a generous way. Next slide. So throughout the year, my team and I work together to thank and acknowledge those donors through meetings and events. As I mentioned earlier, we typically hold small lunches. Now they're Zoom or FaceTime calls, and we've been pleasantly surprised that donors are completely flexible and willing, and because there's no travel, they're actually more available to meet with us virtually. And this really gives donors an opportunity to get to know their fellows. Alumni Weekend, which Dean Watkins mentioned earlier, is another annual event in the spring that rallies hundreds of our graduates back to campus. We expect this year Alumni Weekend will be virtual once again, but in past years and hopefully in future years, when COVID's over, Discovery Fellows have been invited to interface with donors in person at the Graduate Division banquet and to participate in other elements of Alumni Weekend. Finally, the Michael Page PhD Research Symposium is our hallmark donor event for Discovery Fellows. We invite all 1,200 donors to learn about the research being done by PhD basic science students. Third years are invited to attend. Fourth years do poster sessions during the reception, and a handful of fifth years are chosen to make short TED-style talks. Next slide, please. I wanted to mention that the Discovery Fellows program benefits from the leadership and advocacy of a faculty advisory board, which is aptly nicknamed FAB. We wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the FAB members who are listed here. The group is charged with advising Dean Watkins on the Discovery Fellows program and on the selection of fellows. They also serve as enthusiastic ambassadors, both within UCSF and to the community at large, and we're really grateful for their leadership and partnership. Next slide, please. We also have a Discovery Fellows Clinical Council, which is an important group of clinical department chairs who in the early years of the program stepped forward to provide advocacy and fundraising support. Together, this group raised and contributed funds for Discovery Fellows, and that demonstrated their true belief that basic science is a key driver of UCSF's clinical excellence. Next slide. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Charlie Craig. I am grateful to Charlie for introducing me to Roger Page, who's just one of our over 1,200 donors to the Discovery Fellows program. Over the years, I've gotten to know Roger well. In fact, he's now a family friend and knows my husband and my daughter. One of the highlights of Roger's year is coming from his home in Thunder Bay, Ontario, to meet all the fellows, so all of you, at the Spring Research Symposium that bears his son's name. So Charlie, thanks for joining us today, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone, and I'd like to extend my congratulations to all of you. It's a real honor to be able to have a chance to talk to you and to be able to talk to you about Michael. So who's Michael Page? Michael Page was a very special postdoctoral fellow who worked with me. He joined my lab in 2010, and he was an individual who was really, I'd say, a key highlight of him is that he would not let obstacles stand in his way. So you'll hopefully see that as I go through a few high points of his life. And that is, he started his life in Thunder Bay, Ottawa, in Canada. And after receiving his bachelor's degree at Carleton College, he went to University of British Columbia to get his graduate work. Then he emigrated to the United States and did his first postdoctoral work at Washington University. And throughout all of this, he became fascinated with blood coagulation. He was really struck by the whole concept of when you cut yourself, what keeps you from leaking out all of your blood? And what's the process by which that happens at a molecular and even an atomic level, the enzymes that are associated with doing that. And he decided that after he had carried out his first postdoctoral work, and he was able to land an initial fellowship that was going to allow him to continue to work there, he wanted to actually work in my lab. And he would send me emails and he would call, and I knew some of his work. And so I talked to him and I said, Michael, you're doing great work, but I just don't have any slots in my lab. So he kept publishing, and he'd send me a letter every time he got another publication. And he said, Charlie, I'd really, really like to work in your lab. And I said, Michael, I not only don't have a slot, I don't have a salary for you. So once again, he saw that as an obstacle that he overcame. So he was able to land a K99 award, which some of you may know about. And as you develop through your career, should you decide to go to a faculty position, these K99 awards really help you make that transition. And he did this with me. I provided some letters, and when he got it, I got to the point where I could not say no to him anymore. And I didn't have a spare bench, but he said, that's okay, we'll figure out a way. So he came and he joined my lab, and he pretty much transformed it. During the 3 years that he worked here, he did a number of things, but the most striking thing that he did is he developed a sensor that allows you to monitor enzymatic activity in vivo, in particular for the blood coagulation proteins. So you could follow in a non-invasive way whether someone was about to have a clot in their body or not that could lead to deep vein thrombosis or maybe a myocardial infarction. It was a beautiful piece of work. Filed a patent on it and was actually starting to build a company around it. And in June of 2013, it was very close to my birthday, so I remember it extremely well. It was a Friday night, and I was tied up in a meeting, and he'd been trying to get to me. And so the meeting ended. He shows up in my office. It's about 5:30 in the evening, and he hands me the draft of the paper that we've been working on. And he said, "Charlie, I think this is ready to go. You take a look at it this weekend, and we're going to get this thing submitted next week." He then decided at that point, he was going up to Tahoe with his fiance, who was a pancreatic cancer fellow at UCSF. And they lived in Oakland. And so he took the BART to get over to Oakland to see her. And I guess he wasn't feeling well when he came out of the BART station, and he went into a small restaurant that was there, and he pretty much collapsed and he died. And ironically, he died of an aortic separation. So something that his sensor might have been able to spot early on had it been able to be there. But it was a shock, and it was something that now was an obstacle that really had gotten in his way. And I was depressed for quite a while, for about 3 weeks, because I'd not only become a colleague of Mike, I'd become a really close friend of his. And we were very excited about the things he was going to be doing with his life and his career. And unfortunately, things like this may happen to you. And I'd encourage you to follow Michael's plan, and that he was always pushing the frontiers, and he always wanted to overcome any obstacle that was going to come up. And so I figured, why don't we try to channel that and do what would Mike do? So at about the same time, as you've heard, Michael Moritz and Harriet Hyman had this challenge to be able to raise funds for the Discovery Fellows. And they made a triple challenge that for every dollar that an individual could bring in, they would match it, right? They would triple that donation. But there was a little hook to it. We had to get up to 500 donors. And we weren't very close to it, right? This was early in the days of raising funds. And so I reached out to all the people that Michael had touched during the time he was at UCSF. And in pretty much about a week and a half, we were able to come up with 70 donors. Now, Jessica and the other folks in the development office were busy getting other people. And by the time we were finally able to get enough, we were able to get 70 donors that helped push that over the 500 mark so we could get this triple hit with the donations. And that was really, once again, speaking to what Michael was able to bring to UCSF, the people who stepped up. You know, whether it was $1 or it was $1,000 or whether it was $10,000, people stepped up because they wanted Michael, they wanted his legacy to continue. And then that got me to get to know his father. And you can see in these pictures, it's extremely striking. And when Roger is here, who is a force of nature in his own right, he's in his 80s, and when you look at him, you see Michael. And it's very ironic to see Michael in Roger and how excited Roger is to continue the legacy of Michael with this discovery research symposium that's held every year. Some of you hopefully will be able to speak in that. And tonight, if there's enough time, if it's not tonight, it's going to be early tomorrow morning, I will reach out to Roger and I will let him know that I got a chance to meet this year's Discovery Fellows. And he's going to say, how many are there? Because he wants to have his name associated with you, and he wants you to know about Michael. And I'll say, well, there were so many that we had to take a picture of them all. And Jessica has agreed to be able to set this up that we can take a picture of all of you so that I can send them to Michael and to Roger. Sorry, little Freudian slip there, but send it to Roger in honor of Michael. So if it's okay with you, Jessica will figure out a way to take a picture of all of you. And
Yeah,
if you
so Karsten, can we get out of the screen share and that way we can have a nice big screenshot of everyone? Thanks.
That would be great. So if everyone could turn on their cameras, I can see you, and I'd love, this is so great. This is great. This is great. Oh, thank you. This is great. So, oh, and Liz, please, you have such a treat with what you're about to get from Liz. I was fortunate enough to get introduced to her and get some training from her recently. All right, so will you be able to do this, Jessica? Or
so Krista, will you tell us?
And Eric, turn your cameras on too.
Oh yeah, Eric, you got to be on this too, because you know Roger when it comes to. There you are, Eric.
And Krista, you should be on too. And then let us know when the photo's taken.
Okay, so if everyone will just hold, it takes a minute to do a screenshot. So say cheese, and then I'll let you know when it's taken. All right, I got a really good one. I think John got a good one too. Do you want to do one more just to be safe?
Excellent. Oh, I like the mask and the social distancing in the lab there. Evelyn, that's
We should
cool.
do a goofy one.
Okay, I think we're good.
Thank you for entertaining that request from me. And I know that Roger was really going to appreciate this, and I hope someday you'll be able to meet him. If anyone is interested at all in learning more about Michael or about anything about the Discovery Fellows, that I can tell you that you've got the experts here. Please feel free to reach out to me. I'm in Genentech Hall on the 5th floor, and we're open for business. So congratulations again to all of you. Look forward to interacting with you in the future.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Liz.
Charlie, I've heard you tell that story every year, and every year I say it makes me tear up when you tell about how Michael died, but you know, how you all made such a positive, lasting contribution afterwards is just really heartwarming. So thank you for sharing.
Okay. Thank you for the opportunity.
I think we have one more slide, but I want to show you fellows. Oh, here we go. Yes. I wanted to show you all what has happened to previous Discovery Fellows. We appoint about 25 or 26 a year. So you can do the math on that one. I think we appointed our first cohort in 2013-14. So as of this fall, we have a total of 75 in years 3, 4, and 5. And if you are here in your 6th year and your 7th year, we still think of you as a Discovery Fellow. And once you graduate, you're still a Discovery Fellow alum. So of that group, and this has been pretty consistent over the years, this is a group that gives back. Over half volunteer for SEP, you know, our Science and Health Education Partnership. We've had 124 fellows graduate so far. And here's the breakdown. You know that I am a big believer in tracking and reporting the career outcomes of our UCSF graduates. And we've pulled out the Discovery Fellows. And you can see, probably not surprisingly, a significant proportion are postdocs, particularly those who graduated more recently. But look how many are in industry. Almost 4 in 10 work in industry. We always have a contingent who are dual degree candidates. So they're either back in med school or dental school or went on to their residencies. And then you can see that we've got the broad diversity of careers represented among our fellows. So some are working in communications, some are in education, some are primarily teaching, we have a consultant, and there were just a few that we couldn't track down. I think that's the last slide. Is that right? Okay, we've got just a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions they want to ask? You can ask me, you can ask Jessica, anything about maybe we can put the slides down so I can see faces, or at least your names. You can put the question in the chat, or you can just blurt it out.
We have a question in chat about how are the 5th year speakers selected?
Excellent question. That advisory board that you saw, every 5th year submits an abstract, and the advisory board rates them, and then the 5 who have the top ratings are selected. All right, if there are no more questions, I'm gonna say 3-minute bio break. If you wanna go refill your coffee or get some water, go to the bathroom, be back here promptly at 2:15 and we'll start the main show. So we'll see you in 3 minutes. Welcome back to the new cohort of Discovery Fellows, and welcome here to all of the returning Discovery Fellows. Will you guys just do me a favor, just for 1 minute? Please turn your cameras on so I can just see you. I just want to see some faces. Oh, there you are. I miss you all. I'm really tired of this Zoom phenomenon, but it's so nice to see you. Fourth and fifth years, you'll remember that we usually gather in person and we have a nice lunch for you, and then we have a fabulous reception afterwards. I'm so sorry that we can't do that. And I'm so grateful to all of you for making the time to come and join us in this format. And I promise you, I think we've got a really outstanding program. Oh, it's just so nice to see all your faces. Okay, you can turn them off now if you want to. Before we do get started though, actually I want to thank the people who made this virtual workshop possible. I mean, as you all know, because I know you've been doing it with the events that you've been organizing, is you can't just take something and throw it online, right? It takes a completely different way of thinking about how to organize so that people feel engaged. And so you all know Jessica Yenchak, who runs the Discovery Fellows program. The first year fellows just met her, but I want you to meet two people. Fourth and fifth years, you know these two, but first years, you need to meet them and we all need to give them big claps. First, from the graduate division is Eric Rotman. And Eric, will you say hello so that your square is outlined in yellow so people can see your face?
Hi, folks.
And the second person—
Nice to see you.
Thank you, Eric. And the second person is Krissa Williams from the Development Office. Krissa, will you give a wave and say hello so people can see your face?
Hi, everyone. Thank you in advance for submitting your surveys, or if you've already submitted them, thank you.
So when you see emails coming from Krissa or Eric, please, please, please answer them. They are the ones who keep track of everything for us, and they are our prime communicators. I also want to remind you, fourth and fifth years, we're recording this session, so just wanted you to know that. And now, without further ado, I want to introduce today's speaker. And I am delighted to introduce to you Liz Neely, who's going to offer this online workshop about communicating scientific research. Liz did a presentation for the alumni during Alumni Week this spring, and some of our staff, as you know, are UCSF alumni, and they reached out to me, they said, this woman is so fabulous, you need to bring her in for the Discovery Fellows. So we did. Eric reached out to her. We were delighted that Liz could join us. I want to tell you a little bit about her, and then I'm going to turn things over to her. Liz Neely is the founder and principal of Liminal Creations, which is a design firm focused on scientific engagement. And her work began, she is a scientist, she began in ocean conservation, and she's inspired by more than a decade of working in storytelling and science communication. For the last 5 years, she was executive director of the Story Collider. So Liminal Creations is a new venture for her. She's a lecturer at Yale in association with the National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative. She sits on the AAAS Committee on Science and Technology Engagement with the Public, which has the acronym COSTEP, and she sits on the advisory board for the Aspen Institute Science and Society program. I'm pleased to welcome her to this virtual collection of UCSF Discovery Fellows. And now, Liz, take it away.
Thank you so much. It's a convening of the Liz's, aren't all of you lucky? So welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And as you can see, From my presentation title, Personal Communications 2020, I wanted to give you a very serious, very straightforward, and very formal presentation on this, the 230th day of Blur's Day of March 2020. The thing about these kinds of communications workshops or talks or presentations, whether you've done them or sat in them, you recognize that oftentimes, bless you, people are performing their own expertise, which just completely undercuts the purpose of a communications conversation or training. So unfortunately, this is not going to be particularly interactive. As Dean Watkins said previously, it's more of a seminar today. The good news is this means there are no uncomfortable ice-breaking exercises that you will be put through. And what I have done is designed a series of sort of small scale interactive components, primarily polls. So the first one that we have, we'll be putting up for you right now, is just to get you used to the idea of doing these polls. Because one of the biggest problems when you're in a communications workshop or living in this pandemic year of our lives is things get repetitive. They get exhausting, right? And so my question to you is, which of the following generic terms you're seeing in your inbox and constantly bombarding you in messages and social media are you most willing to get rid of and never see again? So for each of the polls that we're going to be doing through the rest of it, we'll have a 30-second countdown timer, and then we'll close out the poll. I'm not running these, look, it's hands-free, it's amazing technology. And so right now, it looks like the loser of our first poll is unprecedented times, which is a relief for me because I looked at my subtitle and thought, oh goodness, I am guilty of this myself, uncertain times. So what I would love to do in this next hour that we're going to be spending together is to, honestly, to have fun. If we're not interested, if we're not intellectually engaged and amusing ourselves in at least sort of that serious way, what are we doing? And what the serious work of this is, I hope to provide you with more sophistication, more of a mental model, an explicit sense of what you are doing in your scientific and sort of professional communications. And so I start the way I always start with this kind of research, and was looking at all of your names. I was Googling you. It's a little creepy, but then I kept sort of reflecting on what it means for you to be in this role of ambassadors. And when I think about this, I've heard just today that you are supposed to be ambassadors and advocates for basic science, for graduate education, for this program specifically, for the university at large, for your own personal research, for your own labs, for your disciplinary, fields, and all the rest of it. That's a lot. I'm not sure how you have time to figure all of that out on top of building the expertise and expanding the knowledge that you're seeking to do in your PhD work. But it helps, I think, also to go, I love etymology. It's one of those things I always get into. And when you look at the root words for ambassador, it means to be a messenger or a servant, which raises for me a number of questions. And I can't tell you the number of scientists, clinicians, surgeons, engineers, people who are very advanced in their careers that cannot answer these questions when I ask them about their science communication goals. Who are you serving? I know that part of the reason you were selected as Discovery Fellows was you are community minded. So maybe your goal isn't to serve science so much as to serve the communities that you come from or that you are working with. What is the message you're trying to take to them and why? And so we have another poll for you just to try and sort of put a finer point on this. Now, you may not have a specific audience in mind for yourself yet, or you may find that you change opportunistically. But I'm curious if you do have a target audience in particular, which of these groups, if any of them, come to the top or the forefront for you? It's really hard not to just sit here and I can see the numbers coming in, and it's quite exciting. For myself in my career, I've mostly focused on adults, and I'll talk a little bit more about this later in terms of the particular approaches that I've taken. But it looks like for you, we have a surprising number of people who are focused on funders and venture capitalists, and that the winner, quote unquote, the highest percentage are focused on high schoolers or undergraduates. And from there, we're sort of all over the place. I am very interested if you have, if you take issue with any of my poll questions, or when you click other and I haven't come up with an answer, if you could type those into the chat. I will be reviewing the transcripts later. I'm not currently capable of the cognitive load of reading the chat and talking to you and running the presentation at the same time. But so when I think about all of these different audiences, we realize we might have unique approaches, we might have unique tools that you're using, and anyone who gives you a template or an algorithm, sort of like a plug and play, the solution to all of your science communication needs, they're trying to sell you something, quite frankly. The hardest thing about communications is that it is all so context dependent. And you probably have a sense of this from the work that you've already begun to do. And so I think it means that we really need to ask ourselves, why? Why are we doing any of this in the first place? And this is actually an active line of research in the science communication space. So I'm pulling up another poll for you, and this is about your motivations. These are pulled from work by Anthony Dudo and John Besley. A lot of their work has been polling on senior scientists who are members of like the National Academies or AAAS or other groups like this. But they've come up with a taxonomy and framework to help categorize different motivations for engaging in science communication work so that we can talk about this with more structure instead of everyone just saying, well, you know, it's the right thing to do. So the options here sort of range from educational things, ensuring that people are properly informed, to the inverse of that, about correcting misinformation. And I see that among you who answered the polls, the top answer was fostering interest or excitement about science and medicine, which is really exciting. One of the problems in the past has been that people took this very sort of antagonistic, scolding approach of like, well, people should know science facts, and if they don't, that's a problem. And so we're just going to throw data at them, which I'm sure we can all agree is not particularly effective for winning hearts and minds, right? Unfortunately, as a graduate student myself, I was of that mindset, you know? So you heard in my introduction, I started working on the evolution of color patterns and visual systems in tropical reef fish. I was deeply, profoundly interested in how do these animals communicate visually? What do they look like to each other? Not to us, not to humans. And I was working in Mexico and Belize and Jamaica and Bermuda. My first ever science conference was in Brazil. You know, this was the life. And I loved the lab work. I loved the field work. The problem was I hated talking to people about my research. And in fact, when I looked back and I found my notes with the elevator speech that I had to write, it was disastrous. I actually said, what do I study? Oh, I study the synonymous to non-synonymous substitution ratios of the transmembrane regions of rhodopsins and the retinas of wrasses, which is fine for other people who are studying that thing. But the woman who was cutting my hair, that really was not connecting effectively. So I was lucky. For me, a turning point in my career, so these are slides from some of that old work, came when a science journalist, Susan Milius, saw me give a talk. I think this was at Animal Behavior Society. And she liked it, she interviewed me, and then she would call me back and she'd be like, Liz, I just got off the phone with Justin Marshall. And I would be so excited because he was a rock star. And she'd be like, no, look, I didn't understand what he was explaining about his new paper. Can you tell me how that work connects to what you were talking about? And as you can see, we got the cover of Science News for this story. And my work was the kicker. It was the last 3 paragraphs of this piece. And when I read it, it was just one of those light bulb moments in my life. She told her readers that I was interested in visual pollution, the ways in which dark, turbid, cloudy water changed how close you needed to be to a fish to see its color patterns and how easily legible they were from farther away. And the power of that framing, it just really shook me, because I thought if I had been able to articulate that myself, maybe I would have had a better time getting grant funding or collaborators. You know, it was through this lens of journalism that I started really profoundly understanding what my science meant and sort of how I could be thinking about it to make it more comprehensible, more legible to other people. And so my career took a pretty hard left turn at this point. I ended up leaving science. It was not intentional. I had a 6-week-long leave of absence, and I can never just stay still. So I asked my committee what to do, and they connected me to this nonprofit. And that 6-week-long break turned into a career I couldn't refuse, because I was recruited to do things like run journalism training programs in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. I would teach basic ocean ecology concepts to journalists. I would talk about ocean conservation to policymakers and the journalists as well, and bring everybody together. It was absolutely incredible. Working in the Pacific is also the first time where I really began to understand that some of the most important stories in the world are not archived in the scientific literature. You will not find them in the pages of journals. They are not peer reviewed. They are the products of long, rich oral traditions and histories, and not every story belongs to everyone. So I started really being fascinated by how the world actually works once I was able to get out of that naive mindset of I will just tell people about my, retinas and rhodopsins and color patterns of fish. As part of this work, and part of the reason I couldn't go back to the science, was not only was I able to work in amazing parts of the world with incredible people, but at the same time I was doing this community-based work, I also was in conversation with some of the leading fashion designers and sort of New York-based glamorous journalism outlets. I was able to bring the Tiffany & Co. Foundation along as major funders and partners for a campaign called Too Precious to Wear. Because as I was thinking about shallow water corals in the Pacific and community-based conservation and management, I was also thinking about deep water corals, which are used in jewelry. And so what we saw were these corals coming down high fashion runways in Milan and Paris and New York. And people had no idea that they were animals, much less that they are things that don't even reach sexual maturity until they're 80 years old. And so this helped me start to appreciate not only the real world communication, science communication that I was learning on the ground in Fiji and Papua New Guinea of how to talk to people one-on-one, and what to do when they don't want to listen to you or when they have no reason to trust you. And then this work, sort of like the higher end of it, was putting me on larger stages. I was getting to go to international conferences on trade and to testify in front of 800 delegates about coral population biology and harvesting patterns. And all of that advocacy work that I was doing was inspiring. But it was also frustrating because I was starting to appreciate that the data does not speak for itself. And I wanted to do more to help get the voices of scientists into public discourse outside of the narrow sort of goals of the campaigns that I was working on. And so I joined a group called Compass. My role here was basically to function as a press officer. At UCSF, you have amazing people, both in your development office as well as in your press teams, that will help you understand and how to promote your own work in social media, in the press. How do you, get up and do a press briefing at a conference? How do you respond to journalism inquiries when you've had a publication? We know that these are important feedback loops. There's very interesting controlled work that's been done around citation patterns, and having your work be part of the discourse in a public space in addition to within the scientific literature has all kinds of knock-on benefits. And in this place, in this work, I started really appreciating the culture of journalism, how to pitch somebody, how to make sure that you had a relationship that when I would call a reporter, they would actually pick up the phone. And if they would say, I'm on deadline, you've got 20 seconds, how would I spit out the key messages of a particular paper that accurately reflected the work of the authors, but was also appealing to someone who needed to sell this to their editors and their audiences on a tight deadline? This is Dr. Jenna Jamback. This was one of the last papers I worked on at Compass. It went really big. You know you're successful when you start to see, like we had a spoof piece in The Onion about America is now sorting its trash into different oceans for recycling. But this work really made me think about, it's like how the sausage gets made. How do we take ideas and get them across? It made me think about platforms and penetration and the role of the entertainment industry. And that led me to my final position before I started this new thing at Story Collider. Story Collider is dedicated to the idea that true personal stories about science are really powerful. Our format their format is similar to The Moth. It's a single person on stage in front of a microphone, no slides, no props. These are not TED Talks, but they are about stripping away sort of the existing messages and stereotypes about what science is like and who does it, and instead showcasing the incredible diversity of perspectives, the science that's done, the hilarity, the heartbreak, all of the things that you are living right now are stage work. And so we tell these personal stories to make them matter. And through all of this, as I was finding and figuring out how to talk to different audiences, from, the villagers on Vanuatu to the fashion editors in Manhattan, to the policymakers in The Hague, to my audiences when I was at Story Collider, I never changed who I am at the heart of myself. And that's a scientist. That's someone who has never been popular, does not understand how popularity works, found it incredibly difficult, and had to write myself scripts of how to operate at cocktail parties because I found starting conversations excruciating and ending them even worse, right? And so through the course of my professional development and throughout all of my career, there has been this constant through line. So I continued doing some publishing in this work. In 2018, I commissioned and reviewed a series of peer-reviewed pieces in PLOS Biology, Conservation Stories from the Front Lines, where people talked about major breakthroughs they had. Karen Lips, for example, shares the story of what it felt like to be a PhD student herself, studying these frogs in Panama, and then having the chytrid fungus epidemic just sweep through her field sites, leaving behind the pathetic little bodies of these frogs. And her question in her piece is about, how do you proceed when there maybe is no happy ending, right? I think these stories need to be told. There's so much richness and value in everything that we talk about, when we're in person together, over beers or in the hallways of our conferences, that doesn't end up in the literature. So I did work like that. I also, as you heard, have a lecturer position at Yale. I'm working to try and understand, how do we use these tools of communication in technical settings as well? So this work with the National Neuroscience Curriculum Initiative is taking cutting edge neuroscience and then using our communication tools to package it in these digestible 7-minute, sort of delightful short talks, so that psychiatry residents will be hearing about this new cutting edge research and can think about potentially how to apply it in their clinical research or just shape their worldviews. And then finally, if you're interested in all the things I've been talking about so far, and you will get a list of citations at the end of this talk, because that's how we roll, this paper, Linking Scholarship and Narrative, really captures the thinking that I've been doing around science communication, why are we doing it, and how do we do it effectively in the real world? Because I think one of the big problems that I've run into is that our science communication advice often, like, quite frankly, between just us here on the call, it's a white person's pantomime of what polite conversation looks like. And we all know this is not how people talk to each other. This is not how they argue. So how can we take the best of both worlds? Sort of this artistic, grounded, real approach to work, and then pair it with the best available social science research so that we can be effective and use our time wisely. This is what I'm trying to do now at Liminal. And as the founder and principal of an organization that has been in existence for a whopping 20 days, I think, at this point, you can see I've gotten really far. What I do want to tell you, though, is that all of this work, all of the thinking, so I'm continuing I'm continuing sort of science communication, practical, beautiful, and then really well-grounded in the research. And throughout, in each of the different career spaces I've been in, I've been sort of united by three major themes when I think about what effective science communication is. And so to my mind, this means that the information itself is correct. There is no substitution here. We can talk about accuracy versus precision, which I find a very useful frame when we argue about science communication and the ways in which we necessarily translate the technical side of our work, but it must be correct. Beyond that, it's not good enough to just be like, well, I'm right, and I told it to you once, right? But that material needs to be retained. That means it has to have this sort of a structure to it that people can latch onto, and that they remember not only that they've been told what the correct information is, but the content of it. And then finally, I want to create enduring frameworks, because we know, and I'm sure you've been feeling this in your own lives, there is this exhaustion and whiplash when one day you're told, don't wear masks, and the next day you're told, do wear masks, or, is butter good for you or not? Is wine good for you or not? How do we communicate science in such a way that people are resilient to changes in whatever the recommendation might be? So I think about the frameworks, explaining the process of science rather than merely the products of it as my goals. So I'll be using these as sort of keep that in the back of your mind for the rest of the talk. But really what it comes down to, okay, is fine, well and good. That's who you are. That's what you do, Liz. But how do we as Discovery Fellows in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th year of our PhDs do any of this? And so before I start to answer that question, I want to take your temperatures and see how you're feeling about your own communication skills. So poll number 4 is about your confidence in your ability to communicate your science. And this should remind me, to those of you who do not identify as quote unquote scientists, I apologize. I use this as a broad and inclusive definition. I think about sort of clinical medicine and everything else fitting into this, but how are you feeling as just sort of in your own skills, your own knowledge, your own behaviors and aptitudes around communicating science? I also will note, all right, so 54% of you who answered this poll said that you're confident overall with some areas for improvement, which I am happy to see. I often think about how at different points in our lives and careers, we ping pong between overconfidence and arrogance, right? We fake it till we make it. And then to imposter syndrome and just questioning everything that we do. And I have found over time, as I get into this, and especially when you're being recorded, when you're on camera, when you're on larger and larger stages, it is easy to get stuck in your own head and to start to spiral to the point where you're just like, what am I doing with my hands? Am I weird? Like, yeah, you're weird. I'm weird. We are all weird. And I want you to lean into that, because I think that novelty, that unique specificity of however it is that you present, however you move through the world, there's value there. And we can find ways so that, I think the worst thing in the world is when people try and fit into a pre-existing mold. of like, ooh, if I just follow this science communication training hard enough, it will somehow make this easier for me. It won't. But let's talk about how. This is my husband. He's a journalist at The Atlantic. His name is Ed Young. And when I said to him, what is your one piece of advice to scientists about communication, effective communication? He said, don't fucking lie. And I tried to figure out if I was allowed to put this on a slide. And then I thought, what are they going to do? Shut me down? The best part is that Ed was giving this advice to fellows at the NIH a year ago, and Collins walked in right at the same moment he was saying this. And he said, he's standing behind me, isn't he? But this is brilliant advice. And I think it tells you something that one of the leading science journalists in the world, when asked what is the only thing that you would want to say to scientists who talk to you about your work, that this is what he would come up with, right? The amount of pressure you are under to spin, to expand, to make your science appealing to donors, to everyone. This is what leads us into things like the replication crises. And I don't want to just have this polite, nice conversation when the truth is much uglier and harder. But we will agree that none of you are lying ever. And I don't need to really belabor that point. And instead, I'll use this opportunity to talk about some of Ed's work and what it's been sort of thoughts it's been sparking for me lately. So his most recent magazine piece was the cover story at The Atlantic. You may have read it. I think this is just like a really stunning and stark piece of artwork for the cover. And Ed has a section here. He ends the whole piece about what the pandemic means for all of us and what we are going to need to do in order to address it. Pandemic, pan and demos, all people. It's a moment of hope, I think, a fitting note to lighten the end of a very heavy piece. And I don't think I can take credit for it, but I would like to point out that in a white paper that my colleague Dietram Schäufele and I wrote that was commissioned by DeepMind at the beginning of 2019, we began with a quote from a play that feels very similar. What concerns everyone can only be resolved by everyone. And this informs sort of when we think about effective science communication, it means we have to step away from the broadcast model, that old idea that it is just us as experts, holding forth and opening the eyes of the world and sharing our wisdom, blah, blah, blah. What are we actually doing? As part of this work, I did quite a lot of reading and thinking about democracy and how the will of people is made known to people who are holding power. And I really latched onto this idea of deliberative discourse. And I hope this is something that you might pick up and use as a framework in your own science communication goals, regardless of who your audience might be. In order to have truly deliberative discourse, we require 4 things. The first is accurate information, which you've already got because you're not lying. We're all doing our best work. Then we need a representative diversity of opinions and viewpoints in the room. And then more important than that, because so the internet definitely has accurate information on it in places and then has a wide variety of worldviews. But what we often are lacking is something called the deliberative stance. This is how I am oriented to you as a partner in my conversation. It means that I take you seriously, that I think you have valid viewpoints and concerns, that you're arguing in good faith, and that the two of us are partners in trying to resolve something rather than opponents who are at loggerheads and will do anything to win a point for our team. And then finally, what we need for all of this to actually work is adequate time. These are all in short supply in many of our worlds. And so I encourage you to think about how might you design interventions or interactions that you have in order to foster some of these things. Because quite frankly, and I'm not casting shade on anyone, the world is full of PhD students who are like dropping in and doing a one talk with a small group. Are there ways that you could actually think about building relationships or continuing this in order to get farther in your goals? And to sort of cleanse the palate and bring it back to you and what you're doing, as I was doing my research about the Discovery Fellows program, I was inspired by when Michael Moritz listed, he said, as someone who is working in venture and is looking for outstanding people of all kinds, the same thing he's looking for in fellows were qualities like being resolute and resilient and imaginative. And just hearing him talk about the skills of the tenacity and determination and creativity he's looking for from you made me feel inspired. And so the rest of my talk is going to be structured around these sort of three, we call them like touch points or touchstones of work. And before I do that, I wanted to ask Krissa, were there any questions that were popping up in the chat, or does anyone want to pause and make sure that I explain something I've touched on before we plow into the final half of today's conversation?
Liz, I don't see any questions yet. Feel free to put them in chat if you have any.
Great. All right. So let's talk about what it means to be resolute in the context of science communication. So for me, when I think about being purposeful and determined, it meant that I needed to appreciate the problems in front of me. And as someone who started in animal communication, I was actually pretty comfortable with the idea that I needed to get to a granular level. And so initially, I was fascinated by neuroscience. I wanted to understand neural correlates of different states. And there's fascinating and fabulous work looking at fMRI of brains that while we're listening to stories, for example, or how language is processed and that kind of thing. But I knew that I needed to not only think about individual human brains, that's very reductionistic, and rather think about the realities of the social networks in which we do our communications and we live our lives. So I have spent, the past decade trying to read as much as I can in disciplines I am not trained in, which always makes you feel nervous like a dilettante, but pulling from risk perception, psychology, all of the social sciences, as much as I possibly could to understand what is known already. What does the science tell us about how do people see the world? How do they make up their minds? How do they assess risk? How do they decide who to trust? Do people actually trust science and scientists? Because there is a lot of terrible argumentation and unsubstantiated claims that are made all the time when we talk about what the public thinks or how people relate to science. And so I found that I very much identified with, there's a model, it's an old one at this point, about communications, right? And it's mapping a spectrum from, on one hand, we've got what's called individualistic communication, which is subjective and intuitive, artistic, it relies on experience, to more of a scientific approach where we are taking advantage of things like empirical data and sort of a more rigorous approach. And it's nice to lay this out. I think I've already tilted my hand about where I have been, where I'm going, and as my career has shifted. But I'm curious for all of you. Poll number 5 asks, on this sort of scale right now, if you had to place yourself, and I just came up with like an arbitrary Likert scale, from entirely individualistic to entirely scientific in your approach, where are you right now? It's fun to see this come in real time and as the winds shift. This is interesting and exciting. So in my experience, people, whether they acknowledge it or not, are operating from a place of being entirely or largely individualistic. I think there's a huge motivation to apply sort of best practices. And I see that you as a group collectively, more than 40 of you, talk about being balanced or having a more scientific approach to this, which is outstanding. And I want you to send me your references, send me the materials, the guidance, the things that you're thinking about, because in practice, what I often find is that it is quite difficult to take the theory that's being developed in these disciplines and apply it to the kinds of real world problems that we face. So it's also surprisingly difficult to establish the veracity of various things that have a very, truthiness, I think, is a problem in communications research, even more than it is anywhere else. And what I found is when I was starting in my career, I thought I would just apply this sort of very straightforward approach, that I would ask a question like, what is the most effective way to change somebody's behaviors around? So like I worked on eating fish, trying to help mothers who are lactating or pregnant decide what kinds of fish species to eat. And I thought, oh, there must be all sorts of dietary and food preference studies out there. I'll just go find some science and I'll get an answer, thinking that this was going to be very straightforward. Except all of you are far enough along in your research paths that there are some answers that we can get. So if I ask a question, for example, about mask wearing and whether people are in fact getting sort of pandemic exhaustion and refusing to behave, there are sources of data around this. Like Dr. Beth Redbird runs Corona Data US. The website stopped updating publicly some of the data in April, but she's still collecting this. So we know that we have specific answers to like, how isolated do Americans feel right now? And are they turning to each other or turning against each other? This kind of data-driven approach to science communication has also been really helpful to me as I think about how ideological polarization has shifted things. So often, you'll hear people say like, oh, well, the anti-science worldview, we need to communicate better to like win those people over. And then I thought, is there even such a thing as an anti-science worldview? This is a paper by Dan Kahan in the Journal of Science Communication that looked like at a range of issues. And each of these rainbow plots in the background shows you whether or not there is in fact ideological polarization. And so for some things like climate change, yes, absolutely, what you believe one way or the other is a badge of your political affiliation, but not all scientific topics are like that. And it's critically important to know which space you're in and not presume that it's the other. But however, most of the time, when you ask a question, all that happens is you end up with even more questions. And this leads us to a position where we'll want to do things like figure out what is our stance towards theory. This is a paper that I pulled from marketing research, which is a really nice way of looking at these problems of convincing people to do something. There's a lot of money here, and it's very real world. And it lays out 3 different approaches: instrumental, conceptual, and translational models of using academic theory in our practice. And so I'm curious for those of you who are watching, whether your experience is the same as mine. Sometimes it might very well be that there are very discrete bodies of knowledge that you yourself can share, especially if you're working in some kinds of health spaces. You might have a very straightforward answer to questions about like, is it more effective to use personal testimony or statistics in convincing African American women between the ages of 35 and 60 to get mammograms? The answer is both. So that's an instrumental approach. But in my own work, I have absolutely found that I'm using the social science in much more of a conceptual and translational way in my science communication than I would otherwise. And this means that despite my best intentions, despite my orientation of course, I don't want to do something if it's not effective. Of course, I want to have a data-driven communications approach. The theory and the empirical evidence only gets me so far. We cannot be continuing to undermine lived experience and practice in things like communication that are both an art and a science. So this is what I'm looking to do in my own work, and I hope that I imbue in you and inspire you to do moving forward. Because I think that being able to integrate both parts of this is the true nature of expertise. And expertise is something I'm fascinated by. In fact, like I have the Cambridge handbooks of expertise and expert performance, which is a delightful, not a quick read. But in it, there were a number of different sort of conceptual frameworks that I think are fascinating. So one, for example, is that a penalty kick for soccer players takes about 400 microseconds to reach the goal. But the goalie takes between 600 and 1,000. And so how can there be this disconnect between how rapidly an action is happening and the reaction, which takes longer, and yet, well, you can't necessarily block Megan Rapinoe, but for other players, you could. What is going on? And they talk about this concept that experts in many domains have this incredible, it looks like they have all the time in the world, that they are unhurried. And what we're really looking at here is that part of the nature of expertise is being able to identify precursors. So in sports, it would be precursors to movement. It would be able to accurately predict what is going to happen before it does and begin your reaction in order to be able to, for example, block the goal. In a communications space, this might look something like recognizing someone having an angry response before they're in a full-fledged fury, or being able to anticipate the kinds of questions that you're going to get, or not say the things that are going to raise questions in your investors' heads or undermine your credibility and expertise. The other thing that we're doing here, and I thought the phrase that really inspired me, was creating time by anticipating the actions of another. And so when you think about how you apply this in science communication, what I encourage you to do is, so many of the trainings that I have led and I've been a part of, they'll do like mock interview scenarios over and over again, or they'll give you examples. What are you doing? You're building up your anticipatory response, your ability to accurately guess what's coming next and form a response, form a reaction before those things can start to unroll. In a different domain, if you're not a sports person, but equally fascinating to me, expert chess players also show an amazing sort of correlation of this. And that's if you show a chess master a board of a game in play and then hide it and ask them to recreate the setup, they're actually marginally more likely to show you what move would come next. So they are, again, and basketball players are doing the same thing. If you show an expert basketball player video of a play in action and then pause it and then ask them to recreate the scene they were just looking at, they will show you where those players might be. And so in science communication and training and thinking about this, the way we build this anticipatory expertise in anticipatory planning is through a cycle, right? Instruction, practice, and feedback over and over and over again. This is the only way that you will find your nerves settling, that you will have those answers that flow easily, that you trust your own voice, that you come up with answers to hard questions. And so I'm curious for all of you, for poll number 6, when we think about being told what to do, having the opportunity to practice it, and then getting feedback as to what you're actually doing, which of these is least available to you as Discovery Fellows? I'm watching these numbers come in, and it looks like roughly half of you have identified feedback as an area that is the least available to you. I don't think that this is surprising. This was what I would have guessed if I had to. And I think that it's interesting, as someone who was an executive director and is now the founder of a new organization, feedback to leaders is one of the most important and challenging things to accurately get, because I don't know if this is the case for you, but friends and family will often just be like, wow, you're amazing. That was so good. I'm so impressed. I'm so happy for you, which isn't useful. Sometimes with other groups, They'll give you incredibly harsh or critical feedback. I don't know how many of you have experienced that. It undermines your confidence. It does things like, they'll say like, oh, you do a weird thing with your mouth, which how are you supposed to fix that? Also, is it even true? This is potentially an area that you might be able to build sort of within cohort support. I have a framework that I really like called Radical Candor. The idea that there is ruinous empathy. That's when your friends and family are just saying like, oh yeah, you're amazing, that was great, thanks. And then there's also just destructive cruelty, right? Like it doesn't help if all you're doing is undermining someone. In order to become a better communicator, you need honest feedback, to be told what you're doing that's not good by people you trust and who you trust to give you the kinds of feedback that will actually help. And being able to respond to that criticism in a healthy way is part of your final piece. As fellows, you know, Michael Moritz suggested that you should also be resilient. And I'm not even going to put up a poll right now because I have a feeling that none of us are as resilient at this particular moment in time as we have been in others of our lives. And if you are spending any time on social media at all, I suspect that your ability to bounce back from bad news or to not focus on cutting edge developments when we have little news, but it's just doom scrolling is pretty low. But I live largely on Twitter and I am curious, so poll number 7 is, if you are on social media, which platform are you spending the most time on here? Including an option for those of you who are wiser than me and just shut all these things down. This is also perfect. Oh, sorry.
Sorry. I just wanted to let you know that we had a question.
Oh, great. So this, and Chris, is this a question that makes sense right here, or should we hold it?
It was about one of your earlier polls, so we can hold it or we can move forward.
Why don't you go ahead and ask me and I'll figure it out.
Okay. It says, I don't find individuality and scientific as inherently opposite. Can you elaborate more on this?
Yeah. So in that particular framework, which admittedly was designed in 1966, the spectrum that they're trying to capture is on one side, the very sort of personal, like this worked for me and this is my aesthetic preference. It's like, why do I use the colors that I'm using in my PowerPoint presentation? That has nothing to do with studies or research about, oh, this particular color teal is more appealing or even is more legible. It's just because I like it. That's what they mean by individualistic. And so then on that particular framework, that would be in opposition to a scientific approach, which would say, like, for example, I wouldn't use this color, like, for example, I know what colors I enjoy in my presentation, but you may have noticed it's relatively monochrome. I'm not using oranges and reds in addition to this teal and bluish color scheme, because I do know that a certain proportion of my audience is colorblind and would not be able to, you know, discriminate between those different colors. So that's more of a scientific approach to the question of how do you choose your color scheme for presentation. But to come back to social media, it looks like we are surprisingly split, with Twitter and Instagram and Facebook taking up the largest shares, as well as not being on social media at all. I'm bringing this up because I think it's a place where our egos and ids are on full display. People are on not their best behavior necessarily. And I think for me, it is the place where I most profoundly learned the lesson that no matter how hard we try in our science communication, no matter how rational and compelling we are, we cannot displace complex and strong feelings by simply introducing more facts. This is an articulation of the idea that's called the information deficit model. And it is hard to let go of a framework like that if all you want to do is educate people and all you want to do is share facts with them. As a group, you actually expressed a lot of interest in inspiring people and sort of sharing joy and excitement, which is great. And it means that it's that much easier for you to integrate some of these social science findings into your own mental models of how and why you are pursuing communication goals. And so, for example, if we want to take this one step further, we can think about risk. So that sort of information deficit model, old school style, would say that, oh, this is a largely cognitive process where mostly what we are doing is thinking about what are the consequences, what are the outcomes of making this decision. We might have some feelings that go along with it, but the decision is a rational one. You know, presuming rational actors is something that economists do quite a lot of. I think for all of us, it's the equivalent of, think of a spherical cow. Think of a rational human and presume that they are only making decisions and only having opinions based on cognitive evaluation. That's one model. This is closer, I think, to what's accurate, or at least it's driving my own work at the moment. And this is the idea that our feelings directly influence how we're thinking about a problem. This is called motivated reasoning. And that the subject of the probabilities of something happening, as well as just our whole lives right now, right, influence both how we're thinking and how we're feeling, and that all of that leads to a cumulative decision. I was able to articulate and get published in a peer-reviewed book chapter a rather pithier version of this, which simply posits that risk is the combination of hazard and outrage. And what this tells us is that risk is socially constructed. When you think about what this means for you, maybe you really are just talking about the joy of basic science, and there's very little that you think of like, well, it's, I'm not talking about climate change, or I'm not talking about direct applications. But new technologies, emerging technologies in particular, run up against social hesitancy around, well, what might the consequences of this new technology be? And if you're operating in a space of just like, I want to talk about the joy of discovery and how cool this particular protein channel is, but your audience is worried about, what does this actually mean? And are you doing genetic engineering? And is that going to lead to, wherever they're going in their own mental process? It helps to come back to this and to remember that to be an effective communicator, again, you want to anticipate that response if possible and react to it instead of just continuing to charge along the path. That reaction, though, is really difficult. And for those of us with different identities who move through the world in different ways, it can be really hard if you're the subject of trolling, or if people think oh, you're emotional, and to try and figure out in your own mind, how can you be resilient? How can you do top quality research of your own while also being a world-class communicator? What are your obligations? When you see misinformation propagating online, do you have to jump in yourself? I don't think that there are right or wrong answers to these questions. You have to sort it out. I know that I felt much better looking to sort of published frameworks by people like, this is Kate Starbird from University of Washington, in which she both reassures readers, and there's other work going on around here, that immediate personal correction of misinformation does in fact make a difference. But none of us can do that all the time. And so when might we engage? Frameworks like this help. But even though I have this in my back pocket, even though I had, shown this slide, read this paper, thought about how I was going to move through the world, I admit that I was caught unaware when I got a text message from some friends saying hey, what do you think about this Plandemic movie? When I got this message, I had already written an essay called How to Talk About the Coronavirus. And with the central argument that all of us are science communicators now, whether we like it or not, and how we can each either contribute to this problem of information hygiene or help combat it. And yet, despite doing all of that work and sort of offering answers for other people, I looked at that text message and I just thought, oh no, am I really going to pick this fight with my friends? Do I really want to do this right now? And so the framework that I developed that I hope is helpful to you too, whether it's about the pandemic or anything else, is start where you are. You are already a trusted, valued member of networks. Your friends, your family, your colleagues, they look to you, they value your opinions, they're paying attention to you when perhaps not that many other people are. And then pick your battles. What you don't want to be doing is inadvertently triggering identity protective mechanisms or turning a conversation about one concrete piece of science into a screaming match about who you're voting for and what should be happening with the Supreme Court right now. Unless you want to have that, I mean, like, political arguments are critically important, have them. Just don't blunder into them if you want to be talking about science communication. Then there's advice about things like avoiding unforced errors. And this is where the research around risk perception has been most helpful to me. It's one of the places where it's most easily and directly applicable. Things like, don't just restate like, oh, you might have heard that X, where X is the piece of information you're trying to debunk. Because what you're accidentally doing is normalizing it. By repeating it, you make it seem more familiar, and we have a familiarity bias. If it feels familiar, it must be true. So we want to avoid doing things like that. And then finally, we ask that you be honest and transparent. But we established that at the top of this talk with Ed's advice about not lying. And so I'm going to, let's see. I had one final poll for you, but I think I'm going to skip those. And instead come back to this idea of, we've talked about effective science communication all the way through, but now here at the end, I want to talk about ethical science communication. And so building on that idea of not lying, what's beyond that? Why do we not, lie? For me, it's about respecting the agency of the audience. I don't merely want to win this particular argument with this person. I want to set up that enduring framework where they come to their own conclusions on their own time, and that, that I answer questions that are meaningful to them, that I'm forthright about the limitations of our knowledge, that I talk about, what they are in control of, and it's not this paternalistic, controlling relationship that has dominated so much of science, that we respect the agency of our listeners. That I also acknowledge that, I'm a privileged white woman, that I don't know what people's lives are like in communities that I'm not a part of, that it's really easy for me to give advice. And I think, point well taken, I'm giving this to you. I know what it felt like to be a third year PhD student, but I'm a ways away from that. And so you have to take this advice with a grain of salt. And then finally, just being honest and forthright again about the limitations of the data. This is particularly useful when you are talking about something that is not your own narrow specific project, whether that's about the fellowship program broadly, about the university, about the importance of basic science, or about things like the basic biology of coronavirus if you're not a virologist. If you can confront the limitations of your own knowledge and accurately map those frontiers, you can go chase down better answers, and you'll be more trustworthy when you explain to people what you do and do not know. And so in my final sort of words of advice to you, this is a workshop as we reach the end of the hour. The third and final tenet that Michael Moritz suggested that you as Discovery Fellows needed was to be imaginative, to be creative. And I think this can be really hard. I can't imagine, quite frankly, what it's like to be at this point in your careers with the limitations that the pandemic has brought and the additional stressors on top of it. I do know that it can be too easy to get tunnel vision, to only, when you're overwhelmed with reading materials that you have to read in your discipline. How do you make space and time for consuming other things? How do you find time to take care of yourselves and your own mental health? We know that rates of anxiety and depression are 6 times higher among graduate students in the sciences than they are in the general population. This is a crisis by any measure, and it's not getting made easier by the pandemic. For me, and I don't know what this is like for you because we're all different, so you find your own ways. I cannot be productive, creative, imaginative if I'm only doing narrow focused work. I have to be doing things like watching Netflix series and reading books by a new MacArthur, Genius Award winner, N.K. Jemisin, or doing things like exploring the record collection that's been sitting on my shelf for years I inherited from my parents, and figuring out, how do I fill my heart, my soul, my house with different ideas, different approaches than what I'm doing in my day-to-day work and in my research. And it's not like there can be a litmus test, right? Like so often it's like, oh, what are your artistic references becomes this kind of, this isn't a dating app. We don't care like if our taste is the same or if I'm cooler than you. I'm not. Your references could be anything. And so, for example, for me, and as a professional communicator now, I go back to things that I thought about when I was just starting grad school. This is a beta splendens, a fighting fish. And I think about the research showing that these animals behave differently when they're being observed. So you put two males in a tank, they'll fight, sure. But you put two males in a tank and then you have a third-party observer fish, they behave differently. If it's another male, they escalate more rapidly. If it's a female, they'll do things like flare their gill covers and display as much as they're actively interacting with each other. Whatever it might be that inspires you, to be pushing the limits of what we are able to create, to be communicators, to be scientists, to be students, to be scientists and discovery fellows. I hope that you've been sort of inspired and not bored by the presentation today. I hope that you take these ideas and run with them. I can't wait to see where you are all going as you become these ambassadors and advocates for the science that we so desperately need. And I hope that you will bring me along with you. Tell me how it's going. Share your stories with me. Thank you so much for spending this hour thinking about science communication, personal communication, and how we all get through it in this complicated world.
Thank you, Liz, for leading today's workshop, and especially for your willingness to give your talk virtually, which I know is not easy these days. I think your point that true personal stories about science are powerful and the framework that you shared really resonated. And to all the Discovery Fellows, thank you for your participation. We appreciate everything you do and will do to serve as an ambassador for the program. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here on the screen today. And I look forward to the day when we can safely gather in person. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, and thanks again. Bye-bye.
I'm really glad that I brought another light but the sun is going down so much earlier than it used to.
Oh.
I know, I'm surprised, but.
Are you on the East Coast?
I am, yeah, so I live in Washington, DC.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say is I would love if you could share my contact information with all of the fellows, because it's so, I just listened to myself talk for an hour and I have no idea how they reacted and
so
what they felt. And I will also send the citations list so they've got the references, because I know that was really important to me, and I know can be helpful for other people. So
yeah, please
Eric,
send that. And because we typically send out an evaluation to fellows after each workshop.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be great to be able to include your citation list and your contact info. I assume you want us to include, your social media contact info, but also if there's a preferred email address you want us to offer, let us know.
I do.
Beautiful presentation. Yeah.
Thank you.
And I know it's challenging, right? To just sit alone in a room and talk for an hour. So it's a tough.
Yeah, you have to be pretty convinced that you have something important to say. And then I don't know, you can never or I try not to let it show on my face, but every once in a while I'm just like, I think this is really interesting, but I have no idea if other people are just like, and in a regular room, I'd be able to read that and just be like, oh, okay, we're going to shift gears. And here I'm just like, well, you got me now. So.
Right. Well, I can tell you that for me, I was writing down notes. I mean, certain things that just seem to kind of surface and resonate for me, I was taking notes. I imagine a lot of other people were too.
Me too.
And I think they'll be really interested in your citations. Yeah.
Yeah, this was also a joy because, you know, having just left one organization, this is brand new material, start to finish. And yeah, it's always fun to try something out for the first time. So thank you so much for this opportunity. You were all amazing. I really appreciate the support and being in good hands rather than just like, oh, I don't know what's happening now. So I will follow up with you with those materials, my contact information, and the citations list. And if there's anything else, please let me know.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
And
everybody.
thanks, Jessica and team.
Yeah, nice to work with all of you again.
Yeah, nice to see you, Eric. It's been a while.
Yes. Okay.
Okay,
Enjoy the rest of
Krista. Okay, take care, everyone.
Thanks, Jessica Chin and Jessica Yanchek.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you, everyone.
Okay, Karsten, I'm gonna end the meeting now. Bye, everyone.